Someone asked me last video to go over team compositions, and I think it's a good place to pick up next. Before we get into it though, I want to go over the different roles. All roles can be broken down into a single sentence. However, each role has its intricacies that make it a challenge to play and master. First, we'll start out with the easiest to explain. DPS or range DPS. Yep, this role is here to deal damage. The things that will separate out a good DPS are positioning, being conscious of cooldowns on tanks, and feinting main targets. Next is arguably the hardest role to play, the healer. The healer's job is to keep everyone alive. Yes, I know real obvious stuff. Stick with me here, okay? Things that will make you a better healer are energy management, positioning, identifying incoming big damage, and most importantly, communication. The tank is where things get slightly less obvious. Unlike ZVZ or PvE, a tank isn't looking for big clumps. The tank's primary objective is actually damage mitigation. Now obviously if all 5 enemies are stunned, then their damage is 0. But the biggest issue I had starting out was thinking about the big clumps when that's not going to do much. I can't stress this enough. The biggest goal of a tank is to reduce damage. Last up is the bruiser. Now, bruisers usually flank the tank in the front line, but rather than being a damage mitigation, they're there to do actual damage. So while you can likely ignore a tank in your backline, you certainly can't allow a bruiser to sit there unpunished. Again, this is pretty broad, and at a later time I'll go over what sets a good tank apart from a great tank. Now before we get into the meat of it, I want to stress that team comps in Albion aren't make or break like say in League of Legends. The deciding factor in who wins a Hellgate fight is who played better, as individuals and as a team. Now let's talk about the default. A tank, a bruiser, a healer, and 2 ranged DPS. The purpose and strength of the default is that it's well rounded. You have good damage output from the 2 ranged DPS, and a solid front line with both a tank and a bruiser to keep the enemy's DPS at bay. The hardest thing for a default comp to face is a dive comp, which we'll get into that in a second. Something I don't want this video to be about is specific meta builds, since Albion is always evolving. If you have interest in specific builds that I think currently work well together, let me know and maybe I'll do a video on it. Otherwise, I recommend checking out Lupac's meta snapshot videos. With that said, I do want to talk about a timeless composition that falls under the default, which is the dot comp. Typically a dot comp runs a tank, a healer, an AoE fire, a curse, and an axe as the bruiser. The power of this lineup comes from 2 areas. Number 1, the healing reduction from the axe. And number 2, the damage that ramps up on not just one, but multiple targets. The biggest problem is that dot comps require a longer fight, so if you're not careful, you could all be dead before your damage starts to do anything. Now let's take a look at the dive comp, which consists of a tank, 2 bruisers, a healer, and a ranged DPS. Some teams may even opt to run no DPS and run another bruiser instead. This team's strength is diving into the backline and killing a target right at the start of the fight. This puts them very far ahead, especially if they manage to pick off the enemy's healer. There are 2 main weaknesses of a dive comp. Number 1, being scouted, and number 2, target calling. If a dive comp is scouted, the opposing team can change abilities and prepare for it. For example, if your team scouts a dive comp, your fire staff should change their W to firewall instead of fire artillery to help keep the enemies out of your backline. The other weakness of a dive comp is if the team doesn't have good coordination and ends up splitting their damage, it can lead to not securing that early kill. The least common team comp is a double healer comp. 3 bruisers and 2 healers. Part of the reason it isn't played much is because all 5 people need to be flexible as to what they're going to play. And frankly, with pub groups that doesn't happen, so it's typically only run with guildmates. I've actually never played this comp for that exact reason. Since it is rarely used, most teams won't know how to fight against it, giving this team comp a very strong element of surprise. Now that you have a basis for what your team should look like, you're ready to get out there and start doing some Hellgates. Remember, Hellgates aren't about which team is running what, but who is playing the best and which team is communicating better. Hopefully you guys like this video, and if you have something you'd like me to talk about, leave a comment. I'm Frosty2200, good luck, and I'll see you guys out there.